Some of the more eagle-eyed of you spotted in my Abbey Road sessions that I was recording winds, strings and brass separately and asked why I would do that. And this is a very common practice, not in just, making albums, but also for film and TV in particular. And that is because we need to make stems, and that is to present to the dub, or indeed, when you're creating an album, certainly something like a production album, you need to create alternative versions, and you need to make it so that different edits of the track can be made. And the worst and most expensive thing known to us is a recall. You don't want to basically not have all of the options available to the end user, whether that be your dubbing engineer or indeed a picture editor who's using your track from a library album. You don't want to go all the way back to Abbey Road and book an orchestra and match up the mics, because there's that strange bar where you can't really hear the cello line. There's also a degree of pragmatism with this approach. Now, we did an entire album in 2 days. That's 12 tracks in 2 days. Now, you could sit there and really rehearse the orchestra and really get the internal balances, but it's basically not kind of pragmatic and affordable. So by separating the brass, the woodwinds and the strings, you really get kind of power over your mixes and what voices are being heard without just adjusting the spots, because that'll often change the kind of perspective, the sound. Oh, we'll just pull the trumpet spots back there and then they won't overwhelm the violins. Well, suddenly what will happen is the trumpets will sound more distant because of all the spill that'll be going into the other mics. As one example, I think something that's very, very common these days also is we tend to book symphonic-sized brass sections but have a slightly more chamber-sized string sections. So whilst the string session at Abbey Road was quite big, it was 12 violins down to, I think, about 4 basses and 8 cellos. For the brass section that we use, which is like 3 trumpets, 4 horns, 3 bones, tuba, I would usually probably prefer to use a string section that was 16 down, so 16 all the way down to kind of 12 to 14 cellos and 6 to 8 basses. We got the really massive fat sound out of that string section, but you'd find if you were to have a big symphonic brass section behind them, certainly I often find the cellos get kind of overwhelmed if they're taking a lead line, if you know what I mean. So it's a degree of pragmatism and expedience and also expense. It is basically us breaking the music up into its constituent parts so we can control it further down the line without having to recall an entire orchestra. Does it sound as good? Probably not. Do the players like playing it that way? Again, probably not. It is the most flexible way that we can possibly approach these things. And I actually go even deeper than that. Now, if you come in, have a look at this. This is my arrangement for that particularly busy track. Now, I've got these regions marked in red between all of the different kind of instruments. Now, what this is actually the top line. And so what I've done is I've coloured those regions for Ben, my orchestrator, to identify on the score, not only the composer score, but on the player parts, and mark them with what's called tacit markings. So if we just highlight all of these, you'll see that is just all the kind of top lines, lots of octaves going on there. And then if we just delete those and see what's left, you've got all of the slightly more stompy accompaniment. The reason for doing that is, again, to give my client as many options as possible. Certainly for something like production music, you really want kind of backing track versions, or I used to call them PA versions, the version that you would make for the singer to sing against when they were doing their promotional tour. So basically, I need to give my client as much flexibility as possible. These are very rich tracks, and the backing track, it's not like you're removing half of the orchestration. The backing track still holds up. But again, it gives me the kind of mixing power that I need, particularly with things like cellos taking top lines, French horns taking lines where there's lots of kind of trumpets pumping away, that kind of stuff. I really want to be able to push the top line out without necessarily just pushing the spot mics, which I'm not a fan of. So what we do is rehearse the entire band together. We get the dynamic markings right, we get the right kind of level of brassiness in the brass instruments, and then we simply ask them to observe the tacits. We'll take a backing track version, and then we'll do another pass where they just play the stuff that's marked tacit on the scores, enabling us to remove or add the melody or push it forward. Now, I know that it can be incredibly daunting to provide a dubbing engineer with the constituent parts of a beautifully sculpted, well-balanced orchestral piece. especially for hybrid works where you're really kind of doing that fine line between the synths and the drums and the orchestra and getting that mix just right. To suddenly give all of those constituent parts to a dubbing engineer to kind of fiddle around with and break may seem daunting, but pride does come before a fall. Even after about 20 years working as a composer, and I'd say well over maybe 150 productions, I have not learnt how to really effectively predict how the score is going to sound when it goes behind a perforated screen, into a little tiny TV monitor, when all of the sound effects, the explosions, the dialogue, and more crucially, the Atmos goes on. Now, if you listen to the Atmos here, it is kind of in the background. Now, TV and film has become incredibly immersive, so what you'd usually find is it would be dialed up to something like this to really put the viewer into the action. This plays absolute havoc with your top end, which will mean that your reverbs will disappear. Now, if you haven't stemmed your kind of electronic drum percussion and your orchestras off, what you'll find is they'll just whack reverb over the whole thing to make it sound kind of widescreen. Also, for some reason, flutes, piccolos and vibraphones are an absolute nightmare. Once all of this top end disappears, they solely operate in the same kind of frequency range as dialogue. So I think if I have developed any skill, that is to spot a car crash before it happens. The ability to spot a sound and go, you know what, I reckon that's going to be problematic. Even though we've already got 8 5.1 stems and stereo fold downs, I'm actually going to stick that on its own dedicated stem because I don't want to be doing a reprint when they're dubbing and I've moved on to the next job. As always, thanks for your amazing support. If you like what I do, hit like. If you're new to the channel, hit subscribe.